What is up, my cutouts? Cardboard Ninja here, bringing you another tier list. This time around, we're taking a look at the light cabins in Crossout and rating them from best to worst. If you like what you see here, be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Cardboard Ninja content. Also, you can come join me on Twitch as I stream live all the time. Without further ado, let's get this started with the basics. Let's kick things off with the basics that light cabins have in common. Unless otherwise noted, light cabins have 100 kph base speed, are compatible with all wheels, small tracks, and sometimes medium tracks when combined with the Golden Eagle engine, and the best movement type in the game, hovers. Due to the overall low maximum tonnage and high top speeds, they typically do not play well with movement parts that limit top speed too greatly or are very heavy, such as augers, legs, or armored or heavier tracks. Additionally of note, light cabins suffer from an inflated power score over other cabins with the same rarity, thus forcing players to fight against more powerful opponents using less mass in their builds. Kicking things off, we start with the Dusk cabin. With an adjusted maximum mass of 7,750 kilograms, the Dusk has the third highest available mass in the game for light cabins, sports an average power stat for cabins of its type, and has good basic symmetrical geometry with good weld points. The Dusk cabin's perk is to increase the damage of homing rockets, those that track enemies when fired with a lock, by 20% and increase the rocket's projectile velocity by 20%. This is at the cost of the lifetime, how long the missile can be in the air before self-destructing, by 67% or 2/3, the maneuverability of the rocket being reduced, and the target lock range being reduced. This perk only works with two weapons in the game, the Hurricane and the Pyre, and is really only good on the Pyre. Cutting rocket lifespan, maneuverability, and lock range on the Hurricane, which is a long-range siege launcher, is beyond crippling to the Hurricane and changes a weapon that can shoot across any map to one that can barely fire 150 meters with reduced tracking. You can find some fun looking at builds in the exhibition by some very creative players using the Dusk and the Hurricane, but you won't find any of them in battle, possibly because this perk is outclassed by another cabin on this very tier list. There's really only one viable build with the Dusk. Dubbed pizza builds due to being as low and as flat as possible to attempt to protect and hide the extremely vulnerable higher weapon systems, they can be found anywhere from 6 to 10k power score, which is where they're most effective. Ultimately, the Dusk cabin is a one-trick pony whose trick can be emulated by other cabins. It may be the best at one trick, but in a game of near infinite diversity, that isn't saying much. C tier. Moving along to the Cockpit. At an adjusted 7,250 kilograms, the Cockpit sports the lowest available mass of the Epic light cabins, and at 105 kilometers per hour, it sports the game's highest base speed, with a slightly lower than average power. It should be noted at this point that cabin max speed cannot exceed 120 kilometers per hour with engines, so the additional 5 kilometers per hour only helps get to the 120 cap with a wider selection of engines. The Cockpit's geometry is unprecedented in Crossout, as it has the lowest profile of any cabin in the game at 3 pins high, with more than adequate weld points and a mounting pocket in the rear. The Cockpit cabin is one of 2 cabins in the game with 2 perks active at the same time. One, it increases the available amount of fuel for boosters, known as charge, by 50%, while increasing the rate at which they overheat by 30%. A good and a bad. And 2, while it speeds the game deems over 75 kilometers per hour, each active booster will increase all weapon damage, the amount increased by both quantity and quality of the booster by up to 50%, which can be achieved by 4 Henry's boosters of epic rarity. It should be noted, as this cabin is designed to be utilized with boosters, the lower than average cabin power can be overlooked, as it is in most cases entirely offset by said boosters. I'm not going to play coy here, this cabin is insane! 50% damage is the game's single highest universal damage bonus and is able to be activated repeatedly at the touch of a button. To put this into perspective, the Tormentor module gives a 50% damage bonus to melee weapons only, costs 2 energy to put on a build, only lasts a few seconds, and has a long cooldown. Beyond that, the Blight cabin, also on this tier list, has an activated perk that increases damage by 40% of thermal weapons only, also only lasting for a few seconds. Builds that utilize this bonus damage in bursts, such as the Yongwang boosters that you'll find at 11k power score, are exceptionally deadly, typically capable of cracking nearly any build of comparable power score in halves. As if this wasn't enough, the Cockpit is one of the few light cabins that is a serious contender to be used in the construction of a Leviathan. There are Clan War Cockpit builds, known as Booster Leviathans, that leverage that 50% damage increase while removing the paltry 7,250 kilogram mass limit. Wrapping it all up, the Cockpit can be used with any weapon system in the game, and grants the highest damage bonuses in the game, with the lowest profile in the game. A clear and obvious S-tier cabin. Batter up! The next cabin stepping up to the plate is the Bat. At an adjusted 5,900 maximum mass, the Bat sports only 350 more mass than the lower tier Growl. The Bat also has a much lower than average power stat, one of the worst in the game. The geometry of the Bat isn't too bad, somewhat average for a light cabin, with good weld points. The Bat has no perk, gives the same energy as its predecessor, the Growl, provides a meager bonus to mass at the cost of literally double the power score at 1300. For up-and-coming new players, this cabin will pit you against far more powerful opponents while not providing you any real increase to your defenses or offenses to compensate. A true hindrance of a cabin. D tier. Ashes to Ashes, Dust to Duster. Weighing in at 3,700 adjusted maximum mass, the Duster has the lowest mass in the entire game. Additionally, the Duster has a critically low power stat and only provides 9 energy, though it should be noted that this is the highest amount of energy for a common cabin. Appropriately, at 4 pins by 4 pins, it has the lowest volume of any cabin in the game. At this point, I need to acknowledge a game mechanic. In Crossout, you cannot die unless your cabin takes a direct hit to kill it. This is why having a smaller cabin is better than having a larger one. Believe it or not, once upon a time, the Duster was the most overpowered cabin in Crossout. Back in 2018, before it was nerfed, it sported the highest win rate of all the cabins in the game. This was obviously due to the cabin's size, but also because hovers used to only be 225 power score, giving this cabin with 9 energy the ability to dominate new players and sub 4k power score players alike. Times have changed, and not for the better for the Duster, with any appreciable movement parts dragging this cabin up to fight against more powerful builds or more skilled players, and with its abysmally low maximum mass keeping it from many of the heavier weapons, except for the Parser apparently, it is no longer the most overpowered cabin in the game, despite its incredible size. C tier. Next up is the Tusk. At 7,450 adjusted maximum mass, just under average for light cabins, and an average power stat, the Tusk has good, if awkward geometry with decent weld points, though both the weld points and the perk encourage this cabin to be at the very front of any build you make. Expose. The Tusk's perk is simple to understand. Ram people with your cabin. With that said, there's a lot going on with this perk. First, the cabin boasts an impressive 75% collision resistance, reducing all damage dealt to the cabin from impacts and melee weapons, which all do collision damage. This is incredibly good, since you will be crashing into your opponent's cabin first. Second, as you travel distance, every 100 meters increases your next collision damage dealt by this cabin by up to 100%, stacking up to 300%. Third, the cabin has base collision damage, similar to other melee weapons in the game, like the Hatchet. Explaining the damage mechanics, such as how collision damage increases based on the weight of your vehicle as well as the weight of your opponent's vehicle, is beyond the scope of this tier list. But you can expect inconsistent results. The potential ramming damage of this cabin is not to be understated. To put this in perspective, there was an entire raid mode removed because of this cabin, where you had to chase down and destroy a convoy Leviathan. Due to how damage interactions function in Crossout, Tusk builds could one-hit that convoy Leviathan instantly. The game mode was scrapped. Beyond being a simple ramming build, the Tusk proves to be more than adequate fallback weapon for drone builds. As with the Tusk, you are never truly unarmed unless they destroy the bit of frame attaching the cabin to the rest of the build. Combining the Tusk with the Cheetah, boosters, and Bigfoot tires is a staple of the Wasteland. A tier. Moving along to the Jannabee. Another light cabin with just under average adjusted maximum mass at 7,400 kilograms, the Jannabee has slightly lower than average power with great weld points but an awkward and larger than average shape, making it easier to hit and thus to destroy than other cabins. That said, the Jannabee's perk is excellent, a flat 20% damage bonus whenever the vehicle is drifting, though this perk only works with wheels, so no legs, no tracks, and no hovers. A side note of this perk is only active while drifting, meaning during the drift. There's a visual indicator of this of a yellow light coming on, illuminating the cabin. This means that damage dealt while this light is on is increased by 20%. So this means that you need to be drifting at the time the damage is dealt, not when the weapon is fired or the drone is placed. The Jannabee is an excellent choice for drones and turrets of all types, allowing you to drop your drones and go drift in the corner in safety. It is also viable for side-mounted pyre builds, drifting at the point of missile impact, granting the same bonus damage as the Dusk, but unlike the Dusk, it can also be used with the long-range Whirlwind as well. Additionally, it can be used as a sneaky mine layer, and is absolutely brutal with the infamous Caucus. With an on-call damage boost that works with a plethora of builds, the Jannabee is an excellent cabin, though it has no perk at all if used with the most powerful movement types in the game, small tracks and hovers. That's why this has to go to the A tier. Next up is another melee cabin, the Cerberus. With one of the highest adjusted maximum masses at 7,650, the Cerberus also sports an above-average power, which works well in its favor for what this cabin intends to be. The first cabin in the entire game to have geometry that falls beneath the frame height, the second being the Machinist Heavy cabin. The Cerberus has surprisingly excellent, near-perfect weld points, despite it being quite a large target that must be placed exposed at the front of a build. Unlike the Machinist, even the part of the cabin that protrudes below the frame height has weld points covering it, though there is an unfortunate caveat with the geometry that we'll talk about in a minute. Similar to the Tusk, the Cerberus cabin has contact damage, like melee weapons, and also has 75% resistance to contact damage, but in addition to this, the cabin's perk is a continuously damaging melee weapon that deals 35 damage per tick. To put this into perspective, this is about the same damage as the Buzzsaw, which deals 33. Because of the perk, this cabin obviously seeks to be the premier melee cabin, but due to its unfortunate geometry, it tends to fall short in this, the only true category it's suited for. The geometry of this build causes the bit of hood over the melee weapon to cover the hurt box of the perk. This means if you end up below your enemy, or if they have a part that hits the hood, it can prevent the perk from being able to deal any damage. And beyond that, the placement of the hurt box can cause your build to be wedged, which can end up flipping your build entirely if you try to ram someone. Beyond even that, the hurt box on this perk is extremely short, which can cause it to be unable to affect an enemy even in situations of near physical contact. The inability for this cabin to be used with hovers due to its perk is a death nail in the coffin for this demon dog brawler. C tier. On to one of the most popular cabins in Crossout, the Blight. At 7,600 mass, the Blight boasts an above-average adjusted mass and an average power. An average-sized cabin with effectively perfect weld points and a powerful active perk, it's no wonder the Blight is so popular. Put simply, on perk activation, the Blight cabin converts the color of any flame weapon to green, as well as grants specific bonuses based on the flame weapon affected. Gaining the least benefit, the Tempura gains 40% bonus damage, while flamethrowers gain the 40% damage as well as a 50% range increase. The Incinerator gains the 40% damage bonus as well, but instead gains a 30% increased puddle size, while the Mandrake gains the 40% bonus damage, but only on the thermal component of its attack, and a 30% increased puddle size, but not the initial blast radius of the shells. A simple, straightforward, powerful perk with a relatively short charge time that charges while moving. The Blight brings the heat and can even be used at the highest tiers of play due to the Firebug. A tier. One of the more recent additions to the game, we have the Deadman. At 7,950 adjusted maximum mass, the Deadman sports the highest maximum mass of any epic light cabin and has an average power. The geometry is asymmetrical and only 5 pins wide, with clumsy, awkward weld points attempting to promote an asymmetrical build style. The perk of the Deadman is fairly straightforward and powerful. The fewer weapons your build has, the faster your weapons reload. Presumably no bonus when you have 4 or more weapons, which would be a feat indeed for a light cabin, 10% reload bonus 3 weapons, 15% reload bonus if you have 2 weapons, and a prodigious 25% if you only have 1 weapon on your build. The Deadman is chunky for a light cabin, and the perk allows for interesting builds when players attempt to seal club. Seal clubbing being taking a weapon of extremely high power score and attempting to bring it to the lowest possible power score to fight new players or against builds that potentially would not match well against it. Additionally, the Deadman has a particular relationship with Kaiju and Yongwang, both weapons that reload, and you can only have one of on a build. This reload perk combines well with the reload module, which can grant 10 or 20% reload speed for a maximum of 45% reload speed when only one weapon is mounted on the vehicle. A final note, this perk helps ameliorate the impact to your damage from losing weapons, increasing your reload speed as you lose them. All that said, many of the weapons that reload are very heavy and not suited for builds with such low mass, and there are other cabins out there that can provide similar or greater bonuses when mounting 2 or more weapons, while also providing more mass to play with. Finally, when having a faster reload speed as you lose your weapons is better than nothing, it is no substitute for not losing your weapons in the first place. B tier. The Aggressor. Above only the Cockpit, the Aggressor has 7,200 adjusted maximum mass, second lowest for an epic cabin. The Aggressor has below average power, but shares the highest base speed in the game at 105 km an hour. The Aggressor has an average size with tapered geometry with adequate weld points. The perk on the Aggressor is all about linear movement. Every 25 meters moving in a straight line, forwards or backwards, it increases damage by 7%, stacking 3 times to 21%. However, this cabin loses charge when you attempt to steer the vehicle. It doesn't say this, but even the most minor turning of the wheel takes 25% of 1 charge, and stopping your vehicle removes all stacks entirely. The Aggressor cabin appears to be designed for lance builds, ramping up damage right before point of impact, but the downside of the perk makes it nearly impossible to get or maintain all 3 stacks, especially in a game where your targets are going to be moving all the time. Despite its downsides, it is possible, similar to the Jannabee, to be a mine layer or a drone tug, replacing drifting in a corner with simply driving away in a straight line. Unlike the Jannabee, however, the Aggressor can serve as a melee build as well, ramping up damage as it pushes enemies along. Additionally, this is another competitor to the Dusk with side-mounted pyres, firing them just as you pass by an enemy. But again, unlike the Dusk, you can use it with the Hurricane, simply driving to increase the damage before missile impact. As an aside, when used as a sideways hover, it gains charge when strafing left and right, and loses charge when flying forward or backwards. With a plethora of builds available despite its clunky perk, the Aggressor fits snugly into B tier. The legendary Harpy. With 7,500 adjusted maximum mass, the Harpy is on the high end of the mass spectrum for a light cabin. The Harpy also sports an average power. When we look at the geometry of the Harpy, we see that it has an awkward shape and is a bit on the large side for a light cabin, and has decent, if not somewhat clumsy, weld points. All of this cabin's faults melt away at this point, however, as, like the Cockpit, the Harpy has 2 perks active at the same time. 1, ammunition crates and microfactory modules gain an additional 50% ammunition or drones, and 2, explosion radius is increased by 20%. There are very few direct fire weapons in the entire game that would only receive benefit from only one of these 2 perks at the same time. In fact, there are only 2. The Reaper minigun, which gets the ammunition but not the blast radius, and the Emily grenade launcher, which gets the blast radius but not the ammunition. This cabin empowers any weapon that has a blast radius, effectively increasing the radius by 1 pin or weld point for nearly all of them, which can mean some big damage numbers. There are also too many viable builds with this cabin to count. It is yet another cabin that contends with the Dusk for the horizontal pyre builds, while still being viable for the Hurricane. This is one of the few cabins that provide a tangible buff to the powerful Wretcher, and indeed all grenade launchers. Epic drones, such as the Fuse, Owl, Anaconda, and Grenadier, are all buffed by both perks. A 20% radius increase to the Pulsar's blast radius, which perk also increases its own blast radius. It buffs the King Mine Layer, making it a viable mine layer, and finally the Mandrake's blast radius, which is 14 pins, which increases it to 16.5. The list goes on from there, but beyond even that, the Harpy is the second light cabin that has real potential as a Leviathan. With a plethora of builds, 2 powerhouse perks, and the ability to be used with all movement parts, the Harpy is clearly S tier. From highest heights to quite possibly the lowest lows, we now look at the Werewolf. The Werewolf has an average adjusted maximum mass of 7,600 kilograms, with an average power. The geometry is thin, only 4 pins wide, but 10 pins long, making it slightly larger than other light cabins with effectively perfect weld points. But after that, that's about it. The Werewolf's perk only kicks in after you die. It leaves a pilotable fuse drone in the place that you died. The drone itself has been made invulnerable to all damage for 1 second after it spawns and has approximately 150 hit points. The drone lasts 10 seconds and you can detonate it with the left mouse button on the PC for about 450 damage. The Werewolf is dead average for a light cab, and once upon a time it was the only craftable epic light cabin. Other than average stats, there is nothing that stands out about this cabin, and the perk is genuinely bad, activating only after death. D tier. Oh man, here we go. The Growl. A rare light cabin, the Growl has 5,550 adjusted maximum mass and a much lower than average power. The Growl has above average weld points, and at 4 pins wide and 8 pins long, it's a relatively small cabin. Since the Growl is only a rare cabin, it has no perk. E tier. Okay. If I had an audience before, I just lost them. If I left this cabin on D tier, I would lose all credibility. The Growl is actually all about its intangible benefits. Despite its low power and mass, this cabin is actually low-key overpowered. At 750 power score, the Growl is one of only 2 light cabins that isn't affected by power score scaling that plagues the other light cabs. This keeps builds using the Growl against opponents well suited for its low maximum mass and low power. The Growl continues the trend of the Duster, granting a prodigious 11 energy for a rare cabin. Other cabins of this tier give 10 or less, making it the premier weapons platform. When veteran players attempt to bring their powerful weapons into lower power score, they look no further than the Growl. Beyond that, as a rare cabin, it has the cheapest fusion cost, and the second tier of the Bulldog co-driver grants the cabin a specific buff only to the Growl, 500 kilograms of tonnage. Because of all the intangible benefits, and because it is the go-to cabin of Crossout, the Growl is definitely B tier. On to the Gryphon. The first epic light cabin in the game, the Gryphon sits at 8,300 adjusted maximum mass with formerly the highest power stat for a light cabin. The Gryphon's geometry is large for a light cabin, 6x9x4, with decent enough weld points. The perk on the Gryphon is powerful indeed. For 11 seconds, you and your 3 closest allies within 25 meters are immune to radar and the effects of the Oculus and Verifier with a 20-second cooldown. There is much to be said about this perk. It does stack with the Chameleon's invisibility, meaning that you can be both invisible and be covered with radar immunity, preventing the decloaking effects from the Verifier as well as preventing the invisibility detection of the devices from triggering in the first place. Beyond that, radar targeting weapons such as the Nest, Pyre, Hurricane, and Caucus cannot target you even after you are no longer invisible. Before making this tier list, I was unable to determine if this also affects the ability for Leviathans and Clan Wars from being able to lock weapons onto players under the effects of this perk, as that targeting appears to be identical to that of the Caucus. But if it does, then this perk is even more powerful, as then it could be used as a base for a Leviathan that can evade becoming the target of your opponent's Leviathan. Great stats with a perk that buffs invisibility, which is overpowered to begin with, S tier. Well, that about wrapped it up, right? I guess there's nothing more to say about light cabs and Crossout, so if you've liked what you've seen
Here comes a new challenger!
What the? Okay. I guess I should go over this then. The Master. At the time of this video, yet to be released into the game, moving at 95 km per hour, 5 lower than typical for light cabins, the Master boasts the new highest mass for a light cabin of 9,250 kilograms, with the new highest power in class. The perk as listed for this cabin is unprecedented in Crossout. Activating the perk causes the cabin to overheat. When deactivated, the cabin cools over 5 seconds, restoring 10% of durability per second to the part or parts attached to the power nodes. For those of us not counting, that's 50%! Up to this point in the game's lifecycle, there has been no way to restore health to any part of a build. This perk has seemingly limitless potential, especially on builds able to disengage and re-engage at will, like hovers. Put simply, the stats on the Master Cabin alone justify an S tier rating just because it has so much maximum mass, it actually enters the realm of medium cabins. Even though this is typically not in the realm for discussion on a tier list, I feel I need to point something else out. When used with durability enhancing fusions or the new Averter module, this can restore far greater amount of effective durability than stated, as 30% damage reduction from the Averter would relatively be doubled to 60% when combined with the 50% repair from this cabin. Beyond this, the scary thing is, one particular weapon may just make this outright busted. The Breaker Shotgun. The perk of the Breaker Shotgun is currently solid and somewhat balanced. When the weapon receives fatal damage, it instead becomes invincible for 1 second, with a 35-second cooldown. This makes the Breaker very good against weapons such as a Scorpion or Typhoon or any single strot hitting weapon that does a significant amount of damage, since the killing blow doesn't deal any damage. However, typically, the Breaker only gets one such triggering of this ability as it maintains the hit points it was at before the ability triggered. But not anymore! Even if the geometry of this cabin is the spinning wooden box and you could only fit one Breaker onto these power nodes, this cabin would be S tier. This cabin is S tier, but time will tell whether or not it's just an S tier or if it's insanely overpowered. Whew. Well, there you have it. Finally, the complete Light Cabin tier list. What do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Voice your hatred in the comments below. If you like what you see here, slap a like. And if you want to see more Cardboard Ninja content, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, my cutouts, peace.